Good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Epstein. It's Tuesday, May 20th, 2025. Welcome to the monthly meeting of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. Tonight, we're having a wonderful program with the author John Bicknell, talking about his new book about the wartime dealings between President Lincoln and General John C. Fremont, who was a thorn in Lincoln's side. And it's a great story. To introduce John is our Vice President of Programming, Dr. John Willen. Here's Dr. Willen.
Um, so John Bicknell was born, raised, and educated in Indiana. He was a journalist for more than 30 years, and he was a reporter, columnist, and editor in Florida and Washington, D.C. And he's the author of two books on 19th century U.S. political history, America, 1844, Religious Fervor, and The Nation and Lincoln's Pathfinder, John C. Fremont, and the Violent Election of 1856. He's the co-editor, or has been, of the 2012 edition of Politics in America, and senior editor of the 2016, 2018, 2020, and 2022 editions of the Almanac of American Politics. And he lives in Haymarket, Virginia.
Oh, yeah.
Very important.
He's moved to Central Illinois now.
Yeah, this is an older biography, but he's now in Central Illinois. That is correct.
John Bicknell, I'd like to get you going. I'd like to just mention, in the interest of complete disclosure, that John and I and John's wife worked together for a few years, 3 years. I was there. He was there longer at Congressional Quarterly in Washington. John, why don't you start out by telling us the title of your book and take it away for about a half an hour. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. Thank you, Dr. Wilt. The book is The Pathfinder and the President, John C. Fremont, Abraham Lincoln, and the Battle for Emancipation. Looks like that. It's my third book, all about sort of mid-19th century American politics, one way or another. There's a lot of politics in this book, more politics than war, really. I don't really need, I don't think, to talk too much about Abraham Lincoln or introduce Abraham Lincoln to this group. But let me introduce Fremont a little bit before I get into the meat of this. Fremont, 1861, was one of the most famous people in the world. He'd gained this fame as an explorer of the West, as an officer in the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, going up the Oregon Trail, going to Oregon, California, exploring paths that other people had discovered. Fremont was nicknamed the Pathfinder, but he wasn't really a pathfinder, but he was a path popularizer. What he did was write reports about these explorations. They were government documents. Today, they'd be produced by the GPO. And they became bestsellers. His wife was a tremendous, like me, his wife was a tremendous editor. And she took his reports and turned them into Western adventure stories. And people loved them. They used them as guides, essentially, as people migrated west to Oregon, California. And so Fremont gained this great fame, so famous, in fact, that he eventually became one of the first senators from the new state of California. He served a very short term. He drew the short straw and was only a senator for a very brief time. But between becoming famous as an explorer and getting elected to the Senate, he served in the Army in the Mexican War in California, where he continued a pattern of insubordination. He was actually court-martialed for this. The president, James K. Polk, offered to commute his sentence, which was to be kicked out of the Army. But Fremont believed that would essentially be an admission of guilt. So he refused the commutation and resigned from the Army. He bought some land in California at a bargain price. The land turned out to be filled up with gold, so he became a millionaire. And all through the 1850s, he's running the gold operation at his plot of land near Yosemite, what became Yosemite National Park. um, and not really involved too much in politics until 1855, when both the Democratic and Republican parties approached Fremont to be their candidate for president. The Democrats were dissatisfied with Franklin Pierce and sort of looking around for somebody. The Republicans were just getting organized, brand new party, formed only in 1854. And really, Fremont was much more, at that point, he'd been elected to the Senate as a Democrat. By the mid-1850s, he was really a Republican, believed in the anti-slavery position of the party, no extension of slavery into the Western territories. And so he becomes the nominee of the Republican Party in 1856, largely due to the efforts of Francis Blair, a name that's going to come up again later. Blair was a longtime fixture in Washington, a friend of Andrew Jackson, who's sort of been exiled from the Democratic Party beginning in 1844, and was one of the founders of the Republican Party. He had a long-time relationship with Thomas Hart Benton, who's Fremont's father-in-law, the father of Jessie Benton Fremont, Fremont's wife. And so he sort of turned naturally to Fremont as a potential candidate. Many of the other candidates, Salmon Chase, William Seward, were sort of wary of getting into this thing in 1856. They feared the party was not organized enough to run a national campaign, and they were doomed to lose. Turns out that was probably the case. Fremont did better than many people expected. He carried all the northern states except for New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois, and California, I believe. But what he did, this is the topic of my second book, was prove that you could win an election just by winning northern states. And that's, of course, what Lincoln did 4 years later. So here's Fremont as the country is on the verge of war in 1860 and 1861. He's trying to find new investors for his gold mining operation. So he goes to Europe. He leaves for Europe in February of 1861. All this time, from between November and February, Lincoln is putting together his cabinet. Fremont's strongly considered to be a candidate for that cabinet. He was thought to be a potential Secretary of War, also possibly ambassador to France. So Fremont's out of the country while this is going on. And he, gives a speech in May of 1861 while he's still in France, essentially calling for the South to come back into the Union. Doesn't mention slavery, says if they lay down their arms now, this is a month after Fort Sumter, then they would be welcomed back into the country and everything will go on just as it did before. This is interesting because of what happens later. When Fremont comes back to the United States a few weeks after that, he is, of course, not made Secretary of War. That job goes to Simon Cameron from Pennsylvania. And he's not made Minister to France. He's made a Major General in the Army. In fact, he made the second ranking Major General in the Army behind only George McClellan, and appointed commander of the Department of the West, headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, and given very general orders about what to do: pacify the state and make it safe and secure as a base for movement down the Mississippi River. And Lincoln, according to Fremont, gave him carte blanche to achieve these goals. So Fremont goes to St. Louis and sets up his headquarters there and begins building riverboats and building fortifications around the city of St. Louis and trying to sort of rein in the general who had been in charge of the army before Fremont's arrival, a man named Nathaniel Lyon. Lyon was, like Fremont in his younger days, something of a loose cannon in the military. And he was determined that he really hated the South. He was determined that he was going to drive the Confederates out of Missouri. So he marches his army westward down the Missouri River and eventually engages the Confederates and the pro-Confederate Missouri Home Guard at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Edwin Bears actually wrote a book about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. You were talking about him earlier. Fremont told Lyon, suggested to Lyon that he should not fight this battle. He was vastly outnumbered. Fremont was much more interested in reinforcing the strategic point at Cairo, Illinois, than he was in reinforcing Lyon's army in Southwest Missouri, which was not terribly important strategically. He didn't order him not to fight, which was a mistake because Lyon ignored Fremont and fought the battle. Not only lost the battle, but was killed during the fighting. This had ramifications for Fremont, of course. Lincoln began to question Fremont's military capacity at this point. And more importantly, really, on sight, was that Frank Blair, the son of Francis Blair, who was a congressman from St. Louis and an ally of Lincoln, also began to question Fremont. Blair had been a great proponent of Fremont's getting the job. His sister was Elizabeth Blair Lee, was Jesse Benton Fremont's best friend. So the Blairs and the Fremonts and the Bentons were all intertwined together. But that all fell apart very quickly in about a month, in the month of August of 1861 into September of that year. Blair wrote a letter to Montgomery Blair, his brother, who was Postmaster General under Lincoln, saying, "I don't think Fremont is up to this job. He seems to not have much of a capacity for military planning, strategic planning. He's granting contracts to all kinds of sordid people who, many of whom were delivering the goods, but at exorbitant prices." Part of that was Blair was upset that Fremont was, that they were giving contracts to Fremont's friends instead of Blair's friends. But Blair had legitimate concerns about Fremont's military capacity. And so Montgomery Blair shares this letter with Lincoln. And when Lincoln finds out, when Fremont finds out about this, he has Frank Blair arrested. Now he's quickly released, but that's only part of the problem that Fremont has. The larger national issue at stake in Missouri in 1861 was toward the end of the month, Fremont issued an Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves in the state of Missouri. He declared martial law and freed the slaves. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't consult with anybody. He didn't tell Lincoln. He didn't tell the governor, Hamilton Gamble, who was pro-slavery, although pro-union, and an ally of Blair. He didn't even tell his wife, and he almost always told her everything. Lincoln read about it in the newspaper the next day. So August 30th, Fremont issues an Emancipation Proclamation. On August 31st, Lincoln reads about it in the newspaper and very quickly sends an order to Fremont asking him, or sends a letter to Fremont asking him to reverse that part of his order. He wanted him to reverse the emancipation, and he wanted him not to execute prisoners without first checking with Lincoln about whether he should. Fremont, instead of just saluting his commander-in-chief and saying, "Yes, sir," responds with a letter that says, "I considered this very thoroughly. I believe it's the right decision. If I reverse myself now, it would indicate that I had not done that and that I believed I was wrong. I don't believe I was wrong. So if you want it reversed, you're going to have to order me to reverse it." Lincoln, as Lincoln wrote, he very cheerfully did order Fremont to reverse the order. But that wasn't the end of it. Then Fremont sent his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, to Washington on a train to meet with Lincoln to justify why he had done this. Fremont's justification was that it was a military necessity to free the slaves. And this is really the great debate, the cornerstone of the debate between Lincoln and Fremont. I spend a good deal of time in the book talking about it. Fremont believed that, Lincoln believed that in 1861, at least, this point in 1861, that the reunification of the country and emancipation were separate issues, and that he was focused on getting the country back together as quickly and as peaceably as possible. And he believed that if he tried to bring emancipation into it at this point, that would not be possible, largely because it risked driving Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, but not really Delaware, the 4 slave states that were still in the Union, into the arms of the Confederacy. So he wanted to keep those issues separate. Fremont believed, and many other people as well believed this, that those issues were not separable, that there was no way to reunify the country without freeing the slaves, that slavery was too integral to the Southern war effort for the North to allow it to continue. Congress had passed the first Confiscation Act early in August that allowed for the confiscation and freeing of slaves who were working directly for the Confederate war effort in half a dozen specific jobs, like basically right at the front or in fortifications, that sort of thing. But Fremont argued that a slave in Alabama growing corn is helping the Confederate war effort. He's feeding troops. If he's tending the home fires back in Georgia, making the plantation work, he's helping the war effort. Lincoln wasn't ready to go that far yet. So he reversed Fremont. Fremont sent his wife to D.C. And probably many of you are familiar with it's quite a famous confrontation between Jesse Fremont and Abraham Lincoln, meeting late one night in the White House, where Lincoln is rather rude to her. She traveled a long way, was very tired. Lincoln didn't even ask her to sit down. Chided her and her husband for doing this. Probably was somewhat put off by the fact that it was a woman doing this, that Fremont had sent his wife. Fremont didn't think twice about it. He was used to Jesse doing these kinds of jobs for him. She had basically been his campaign manager in 1856. He was quite modern in that sense. Lincoln was not, and he did not take too kindly to being lectured by Jesse Benton Fremont. So she went back to Missouri after meeting with Lincoln and after a brief meeting or a couple-hour meeting with Francis Blair, in which she found out that Frank had basically been spying on Fremont for Lincoln. That's when Fremont found out about the letter to Montgomery and basically had Frank arrested. He was quickly released. Fremont ordered him to get back to work. He was a colonel in the state militia under Fremont's orders. Blair basically said, no, I'm not going to work for you anymore. And Fremont had him arrested a second time. This time, Lincoln intervened very quickly. Blair was released a second time. And that really sealed Fremont's fate. It was the controversy with the Blairs more than the Emancipation Order that did him into Missouri. Toward the end of the month of September, after all the arrests and releases had taken place, Fremont began moving across the state with himself leading the army. They were many miles behind the Confederates, who were also at the same time sort of fleeing toward the southwest. They never did catch up. Lincoln sent Simon Cameron and some other people, including Montgomery Blair, out to Missouri to try to talk some sense into Fremont. He sent a General David Hunter to Missouri to sort of be Lincoln's eyes and ears inside Fremont's camp. Fremont didn't really give him anything to do. Put him in charge of a group of soldiers. but didn't have him do anything with them except march across the state. They got to Springfield, far southwest corner of Missouri, fought one small cavalry engagement. And at the end of the month of October, basically Fremont had talked Cameron into letting him chase the Confederates and fight a battle before being relieved. He never did catch up. And so I think on October 24th, Fremont was relieved of command in Missouri. This disturbed the anti-slavery abolitionist people in the North. They really believed that Fremont was relieved from command because of the Emancipation Order. And he quickly became quite a hero to that faction of the Republican Party. He became what I call the military embodiment of emancipation. He was the one significant figure in the military who was overtly abolitionist. So between the time he was relieved, the end of October, and the following spring, there are a lot of people whispering or shouting in Lincoln's ear about giving Fremont another command. He hadn't been tested. He had not achieved militarily what he had hoped to achieve, but he had in fact maneuvered the Confederates out of Missouri. So Missouri was relatively secure. The war continued there for 4 more years. It was one of the most violent places in the country. I think more battles were fought in Missouri than in any other state except Virginia. And a lot of very small guerrilla type encounters between both uniform and non-uniform combatants in Missouri. But St. Louis was safe, and they could use it as a base, and they did. The boats that Fremont had commissioned and paid exorbitantly for were the boats used by Grant when he moved down the river and eventually captured Vicksburg. Fremont also gave Grant his first field command in Missouri. So for that intervening time, Fremont became this sort of hero to the abolitionist movement. So in the spring of 1862, Lincoln felt compelled to give Fremont another command and put him in charge of the Army, the Mountain Department in Western Virginia, headquartered in Wheeling, which was in a part of Virginia still. And in 1862, in the spring and summer of 1862, not quite to the summer, Fremont worked with 2 other generals, Nathaniel Banks, another politician who'd been Speaker of the House, and Irvin McDowell, although McDowell was caught in between Fremont and McClellan, and basically his second in command, James Shields, was the active agent. But nobody was in charge of these 3 generals out in the field. They were being ordered about by Lincoln and Stanton back in Washington. One historian said the 2 lawyers were directing the war for the 3 generals, and it didn't work out very well. Fremont was not militarily competent. Before the war, he had never commanded more than 300 or 400 men at a time. And yet these expectations, the national expectations for Fremont, this great national hero, were very, very high. But he just did not prove to be up to the job. And in Virginia, he not only was not up to the job, Lincoln gave him a job that was not accomplishable. First, he had asked him to march down the valley, cross the mountains, and attack East Tennessee. Well, there was no way to do it. Sherman had told his commanders, the Army commanders, the previous fall that it couldn't be done. It was sort of a pet project of Lincoln's because he really wanted to secure East Tennessee, which was strongly Unionist. But it was not possible to do that from Virginia. And Fremont was up against Stonewall Jackson, who was militarily competent, of course. And he basically ran Fremont off the map. So toward the middle of June, the end of June, In 1862, Fremont loses a battle to Jackson at Cross Keys near Harrisonburg in Virginia. If you drive down 81 from in Virginia, you would go past it. And so Lincoln finally decides that he needs to put somebody in charge out there. And he chooses, the man he chooses, John Pope, had served under Fremont in Missouri insubordinately. Fremont did not like Pope. Pope did not like Fremont. And Fremont was senior to Pope. Pope was a West Pointer. West Pointers did not much like Fremont. They perceived him as getting favorable treatment most of his career from Thomas Hart Benton, which was true. And when Pope was put in charge of the Army of Virginia, uniting these three smaller armies under one command, Fremont said, "I'm not going to serve under Pope," and he didn't leave the army, but he resigned command of that smaller army. And he basically went to New York, left the war, and went to New York and sort of waited for the next shoe to drop, and it never did. There was talk in 1863 of making him, putting him in command of all black troops, as the recruitment of black troops was gearing up at that point. That did not come to fruition, largely because I think Fremont was afraid to take that job on for multiple reasons. There was talk of making him military governor of North Carolina, a job for which he was completely ill-suited, and he did not get that job either. And so by the middle of 1863, by the middle of 1862, when Fremont has left his command in Virginia, we begin to see Lincoln's evolution in terms of emancipation. It actually happened much sooner than that, although not publicly. As far back as December of 1861, Lincoln had begun lobbying members of Congress for a plan he was going to propose, basically for federal subsidies for compensated emancipation. He brought in border state members from Kentucky and Missouri, Maryland, to lobby them for this proposal. They would have none of it. They were not interested in federal subsidies. They were not interested in gradual emancipation or emancipation of any other kind. So that plan failed, but it shows that within September, October, within 3 months of his revoking of Fremont's emancipation order, Lincoln was already beginning the process of emancipation being a part of the war effort. In March, he made this proposal officially to Congress. Congress turned it down. But in April, Congress enacts emancipation, abolishes slavery in the District of Columbia. Lincoln signs the bill. Within April, May, June, July. In July, McClellan sends a famous letter to Lincoln explaining how Lincoln ought to be thinking about running the war, and it doesn't have anything to do with slavery. And this sort of tips, Montgomery Blair believed this tipped Lincoln over the edge in terms of what he was going to do about emancipation. Because within a couple of weeks after that letter, Lincoln holds the famous cabinet meeting at which he unveils the original draft, the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. So he had come full circle in less than a year from rejecting the very notion of military emancipation, which Fremont had proposed in August in 1861, to endorsing military necessity as a justification for emancipation in July of 1862. Lincoln was never a reluctant emancipator, but he was reluctant to, early on, he was reluctant to combine those two efforts, and he always had concerns about the legality and the constitutionality of using military necessity as a justification. And in fact, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, he continued to worry about whether the courts might overturn it or whether people freed under his edict would have to be returned to slavery once the emergency of the war ended. That's one reason he fought so hard for the 13th Amendment. So by 1863, middle of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued. Fremont and Lincoln are basically on the same page in terms of emancipation, but their differences haven't disappeared. Fremont, much harder proposals for a post-war South than Lincoln. Lincoln much more likely to be soft on the South had he lived than Fremont would have been. And there begins to be a movement coalescing among some anti-Lincoln people in the Republican Party for Fremont to run for president in 1864. Fremont likes this idea, so much so that he commits fairly early on that if he can't win the Republican nomination, he'll probably run as a third-party candidate. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Lincoln, largely because of the way the war is going. The war is not going very well. True, the North had won battles at Gettysburg, it had captured Vicksburg, and freed the Mississippi River from the Confederacy. But into the early months of 1864, things are not going that well. Grant begins the overland campaign in May of 1864. Salmon Chase is considered a possible alternative to Lincoln. He's sort of chased from, no pun intended, chased from the field early on, but he's still sort of hovering out there as a potential replacement for Lincoln. And Fremont is nominated in a convention in Cleveland called the Radical Democratic Convention toward the end of May in 1864. About a week later, Lincoln wins the Republican nomination. And then in August, things are looking even worse. The war is going badly. Lincoln's popularity is nosediving. And now he has to worry about Fremont over here on his flank. He writes the famous blind memorandum that he seals up in an envelope and asks the cabinet members to sign without their reading it, which essentially says, I will need, I'm probably going to lose this election, and I'm going to need to save the Union between November and March, because whoever is elected president will make promises that will make it impossible for him to save it afterward. And then everything changes. The Democrats nominate McClellan, but stick him with a peace plank in the platform that even McClellan rejects. Essentially a peace at any price plank. And then Sherman captures Atlanta. Sheridan begins to have victories in the valley where Fremont had failed. And something that happened a couple weeks earlier, the capture of Mobile, which had seemed like a small thing at the time, now begins to look like the beginning of a trend toward victory. Lincoln's fortunes completely reverse, and there begins to be talk of Fremont withdrawing from the race, to make sure that nothing can deprive Lincoln of victory. It's really the poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, who's a friend of the Fremonts, whose poem about Fremont actually begins my book, who persuades Fremont that the most important thing is that McClellan not be elected. So there are a lot of political machinations that surround this, including one by a senator from Michigan, Zachariah Chandler, whose main goal is not just to get Fremont out of the race, but to get Montgomery Blair out of the cabinet, because the abolitionists really don't like Montgomery Blair. And that all works out. Fremont withdraws in the middle of September rather ungracefully, says nasty things about Lincoln on his way out the door. But Blair does resign, so he at least got that out of it, even if he refused to consider it part of a deal. And of course, Lincoln is reelected easily. Probably would have been reelected with Fremont in the race. I've run a few of the numbers. It doesn't look like anything Fremont did would have cost Lincoln any states. He might have cost him Massachusetts, and having a smaller chance that he might have cost him New York. But even that seems unlikely. And even if he had lost those states, Lincoln still would have won the election. So that's the end of the political part of the story. But the topper really came a few months later, after Lincoln is reelected. An ally, an Illinois ally of Lincoln, Joseph Medill, writes Lincoln a letter and suggests that he, in all magnanimity, letting bygones be bygones, nominate Fremont to be ambassador to France, which takes some gall, I have to say. Lincoln, as far as I could tell, I have found no record of a response. Lincoln ignored it, and his relationship with Fremont was over. Of course, Lincoln died 3 or 4 months after that. Fremont went on to basically lose all of his money, making bad investments. Spent the rest of his life being supported by his wife's writings. Briefly served as governor of the Arizona Territory, sort of a sinecure job that Rutherford B. Hayes gave him. Hayes had actually served under Fremont during the war. And they died 12 years apart. Jesse Fremont died in 1890, sort of almost forgotten by his countrymen. Jesse lived 12 more years, died in 1902. But all her life, she remained very bitter toward Lincoln. She believed Lincoln had done her husband wrong, and she never really got over how he had treated her or how she perceived that he had treated her husband. That's the story of Lincoln and Fremont in the Civil War. So, thank you.
Excellent presentation, John. Thanks a million. Now we will open it up for questions, comments. I'll go first using my prerogative. You mentioned how incompetent Fremont was in these various jobs. Was there any job Lincoln could have given him that he would have proved competent at?
You know, it's hard to say. I think he couldn't have been worse than Cameron as Secretary of War. Cameron was also in completely over his head and crooked to boot. So would he have? It's hard to say. He didn't really ever show any real executive ability. He commanded, groups of 30 or 40 mountain men in the wilds of the Rocky Mountains, and he had command of, I think, 300 men in California. But as a businessman, he was just dreadful. He was not crooked. He had a lot of problems in St. Louis with contracts, mostly due to a crooked quartermaster who he was sort of stuck with, a regular Army guy named Justice McKinstry, who really was a crook. But Fremont's philosophy on that was, look, I'm just going to spend, we need stuff. Washington's not sending us any stuff. We've got to have saddles and canteens and guns and horses, and we got to buy them all. And we need brokers to do that. And we're going to pay whatever we have to pay. And, the receipts be damned. I don't think he could have put Fremont in charge of a division, a much smaller military unit than an entire army. 8 or 10,000 men under a competent commander, and that might have worked. But the truth is, he couldn't have done that because Fremont's position politically in the country wouldn't have allowed it.
Anyone else have a question or comment?
Yeah, I have one, Ed. That's very good, fascinating. Was there much truth to the story that Fremont had ideas of maybe setting up a separate empire of the West? In other words, should the Union just fall apart, that somehow he would create this new nation? This is something I ran across in the diaries of Montgomery Meigs,
Yeah, Meigs.
who, yeah, Meigs went down out with Blair, I believe, and what he said about Fremont was pretty disastrous. He compared him to Aaron Burr,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, which says a lot right there.
There was a lot of commentary about that among the people who really didn't like Fremont. A lot of that came from the West Point officer class, who really resented Fremont's position as the favoritism he'd been shown. Um, they were very upset that he'd been given the number two spot as Major General. Um, there is not a shred of documentary evidence to this effect. I could find none. His actions in Missouri didn't really show that that was something he had in mind. And what happened at the, when he was relieved, they were many of the people like Meigs, Lorenzo Thomas, who had spread some of this nonsense, excuse me, believed that Fremont was going to defy the order to hand over the army. Of course, he didn't. He very gracefully handed over command to David Hunter and left the field. I don't think there was ever any indication. Lincoln's version of the meeting with Jesse is the one solid piece of evidence, because we sort of have to believe Lincoln, right? Although even that has a caveat. That he said that Jesse had told him that the phrase he used was compare titles, which is sort of an oblique reference to what you're talking about. But even that story is secondhand from John Hay. It's in Hay's diary, recording a conversation with Lincoln and some other people 2 years after the fact. So even that one is a little sketchy. I don't believe there's certainly no real evidence. And I don't believe it was ever in Fremont's mind to do such a thing. It just didn't. He couldn't even run the department. How is he going to run a new country? And it's just, it really didn't make any sense. But it was a good thing to say, because Fremont had this reputation as being someone who defied orders, who'd been court-martialed, who was a loose cannon. So if you wanted to make Fremont look bad, that is exactly what you would say about him.
Since you mentioned Jesse, and when you talk about Fremont, you're saying like he sounds like he's got kind of an ego, and yet he's not overly competent. He's confident, but not overly competent, which was a trait with a lot of generals in there at that time. But Jessie had a background, and her father was connected. And I mean, what was their relationship, to the extent of, was she just being supportive of him, or was she kind of controlling to some extent him?
There are some people who have made that case. I really think, I mean, I've read and written a lot about both of them. To me, it's a partnership. She is the much more ambitious one politically. Fremont was not a natural politician. He was sort of a reticent man, soft-spoken, charismatic. Everyone who met him, almost everyone who met him, mentioned sort of he had this magnetism about him. He was a good-looking guy, and he had this sort of hero status, which added to his allure. But she was really the one who organized, who ran interference, along with her father. And you could say was the brains of the operation. But I don't think it would be fully fair to say that she was controlling him. He, I mean, he was a man in the 19th century. It's been very difficult for him to appear to be sort of being pushed around by his wife. So even if he was, it wouldn't have been a very good look. She had sort of her own constituency. She was very popular in the 1856 campaign. When people wrote about what might happen if he was elected, they didn't say what Fremont would do. They said what the Fremonts would do. It was very much like the Clintons in the 1850s. Journalists wrote about what the Fremonts would do in the White House. It was unprecedented. No one had ever written anything like that. And so there was an understanding. A lot of people said, obviously, what you're talking about, just she's really sort of the stronger one here. And in many ways, she was the stronger one. But I don't think we can absolve Fremont of responsibility for his actions by blaming his wife.
I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead, George.
My name's George Deitch. I had spent 10 years as a member of the Lincoln Group until I moved away from the DC area about 10 years ago. And a little aside before I ask my question, I moved back to my hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania, and became the executive director of the Historical Society here. And Erie County was one of the very few counties in 1856 in Pennsylvania that voted for Fremont. Of course, Buchanan was a favorite son, and so Erie County was always tending to be a bit abolitionist, and so we had actually given Fremont the vote in '56. But anyway, getting to my question, John, you mentioned that he had been very successful in California, managing his property, gold operation and whatnot. And then you mentioned later that he was something of a disastrous businessman and had lost a lot of money. How do you reconcile the two? It sounded like he did all right early, but not so good later.
Part of it was luck. He had bought this property for $3,000. And so when it began producing gold, he was just flooded with revenue. So he got very rich very quickly with very little effort. But then he wanted to expand the operation. They set up a pressing operation. They had to refine the gold. It became much harder to get the gold, so it cost more money. So that's when they began looking for investors, borrowing money. So he had become rich and sort of had this stash of cash without too much business acumen being required. When it became a more complicated business, he had to bring in other people to do it because he didn't know what he was doing. Which is not, I mean, he was not trained as a businessman. He didn't. But he also wasn't a very good judge of people. And some of the people he chose weren't very honest. And so they essentially took advantage of him. By 1864, he had thrown in the towel, he'd given up. He'd sold his final part of that business. And he had sold the land, or the gold mining business anyway. And then he began investing in railroads, always an iffy business. But again, he's doing it without any real deep knowledge about how railroads are run. He's just investing the money that he has. And when they go down the tubes, he goes down the tubes with them. He was actually convicted of bond fraud in absentia in France for selling fraudulent railroad bonds in France. So he was never able to return to France later. That's after the war. So he didn't have, the man, Josiah Royce, a philosopher, a friend of an acquaintance of Fremont's, wrote that he had all the attributes of genius except ability. which I think is a perfect summation of Fremont. He had this terrific personality. People liked to be around him. He had a charisma. He was, magnetic. But as someone else said, the more you knew him, the more questions you had. The better you knew him, the more questions you had. And you saw that in St. Louis, where he just was not, he did not pay attention to the details of purchasing. He wanted to get the stuff, so he got it. And how he got he didn't much care. He was, and that, there were many investigations of that procurement system, and he did not come out looking too good in any of them. Not crookedly, just not effectively.
Okay, well, thank you. That clears up.
On the Erie thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just was saying that clears up that dichotomy.
Yeah. On Erie, if you look at the electoral map of 1856 in Pennsylvania, it looks like a map of the country. Is that northern tier of counties all voted for Fremont, and the middle tier is split pretty evenly between Fremont and Fillmore and Buchanan, and then the southern tier of counties is completely Buchanan. It's just a microcosm of the entire country in that one state.
And Erie County was consistently Republican, Lincoln voted more for Lincoln in the re-election, and up through the rest of the 1800s, almost every county row office was consistently Republican until finally the Southern and Eastern European immigration began to overwhelm the German and native types. So it evolved, but it was from 56 on, it was strongly.
Thank you, George, for the question. Glad to have you back as a member of the group.
Well, I haven't seen you guys in almost a decade, so it's nice.
Well, here you are. Come and join us. We're on Zoom every meeting now, so there you go. You have no excuse not to come.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll follow up with what you were saying, John, in this amazing discussion. The book discussion has had the book group had a session in following up on Fremont as well. And there's so many, it's a conundrum, inconsistency, but what you were just saying about his personality, kind of scattershot, kind of makes me wonder, is that why he would take so much to create this emancipation, this preliminary position, take this position, and what that meant to so many around him, and of course to the enslaved, and then, but you don't see a follow-up from that. It just seems scattershot, like it was a good thing to put out for the moment. It didn't seem like he had the will to really dig and do any follow-up or have any real intention along that way. What is your take on that and his position really on digging in with this issue of emancipation?
He was an impulsive decision maker, partly because the nature of his existence as an explorer required that kind of decision making. It's saying that you don't have if the avalanche is coming at you, you don't hold a meeting. But in this case, Fremont never had a long record of anti-slavery activism. When he was a senator, a very brief time, but he had voted to end the slave trade in the District of Columbia, for example, but he voted against a bill, abolition, in 1851. So he didn't have this long record of activism. And the way Lincoln and Fremont approached emancipation, the way you framed it is perfect, because it shows the differences between the two men. That Lincoln was lawyerly, thoughtful, consistently anti-slavery, with just this entire body of philosophy undergirding his theories. And Fremont was like, man, we got to do something. And, there's nothing wrong with that, because in Missouri in August of 1861, they did need to do something. It was the state was coming apart. So he acted in good faith, but as was so often the case with Fremont, he acted without too much forethought, and in sort of solitary. He didn't consult with anyone. He didn't try to build a coalition. He didn't talk to the people he needed to talk to. If he had, it would never have happened. But it is a perfect example of how these two men were different, personally, philosophically. In fact, I've got in the introduction to the book, I talk about that very thing and how they were, they shared many traits in common. They were both from the South. They were both born in the South. They both had sort of very politically minded wives. They had both gone from being very poor to very famous, well-off successes in the West. But their differences defined them. Lincoln adhered to the Constitution and the rule of law. Fremont would bend the rules at any opportunity if he thought it would help him achieve his ends. Lincoln's opposition to slavery was grounded in the Declaration of Independence and a lifetime of thoughtful consideration of the issue. Fremont's was, while perfectly faithful to the idea, was an impulsive decision to achieve an immediate end. And after that, he was after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Fremont never said a word about it. Never said a word about it, and really was chastised by people like William Lloyd Garrison about that. That Fremont wanted their support, but when Lincoln did this great thing, Fremont couldn't even be magnanimous enough to congratulate the president or to endorse the emancipation.
Doris, you have your hand up?
Okay, well, I'm here in St. Louis, and I really enjoyed your talk. I really appreciate all your remarks about St. Louis and Missouri. You're very right on. And I'm working on a book that I really was interested tonight in hearing more about the relationship, and you were very helpful about the relationship of Jesse and Fremont. And do we know anything about where they lived or anything while they spent their time in St. Louis?
Yeah, they actually rented the Brant Mansion. I think I have not the address, but like the intersection that's in the book. I don't remember off the top of my head, but this was a house owned by, I think, Jesse's aunt, which they charged the government like $500 a month for. But they needed the space. I mean, it was a pretty big operation. But if you, in the book, there's a lot of discussion about what went on in St. Louis, not just once Fremont got there, but I sort of have to lay out the lay of the land from January to July of 1861, which has a lot to do with Frank Blair and the Camp Jackson massacre and all that stuff that went on in St. Louis. So yeah, there is some of that.
Was Fremont in St. Louis at that time of the Camp Jackson affair?
No, that happened in May. He arrived in July.
Okay.
He was in Missouri it's called, in fact, it's like Napoleon. It's called Fremont's 100 Days. He arrived on July 25th, I think. Then, of course, in the end of September, he took off across the state and was relieved of duty on October 24th. So,
well, Jessie is quite a personality in herself, and she did do a lot of writing and that. and promoting of her husband and that. I know that she later, I know for a fact that she did a lot of ghostwriting about in William Elliott's book about the Emancipation Monument and the story of Archer Alexander. And I know she did some ghostwriting portions of it. Um, how strong was her feeling against Lincoln? I
Oh,
mean, I find it so funny that she's writing about a monument about Lincoln, and how strong were her feelings? Can you say?
well, they probably needed the money at that point. She remained bitter her whole life. Um, and there's she essentially wrote two unpublished memoirs here at the Bancroft Library, University of California. And they're just, the latter portion is just filled with commentary about, I wish I could tell this story, but the manner of Lincoln's death makes it impossible to attack him. But there are some letters that survived that, in which she demonstrates that she never got over it. She was unhappy with Lincoln till the day she died. She wrote a book during the war about I mentioned that earlier, the cavalry charge in Springfield. She wrote a book called The Story of the Guard. It was essentially a collection of letters between her and Fremont, with some commentary in between, telling the story of this cavalry charge, which she viewed as sort of the heroic culmination of Fremont's march across the state. She believed it would justify him in the eyes of the country, and to some degree it did. It was part of his rehabilitation, and it sold well, and she donated the proceeds to the widows and orphans of those killed in the battle.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else have a
Reading your
question?
book.
Anyone else have a question? John, I wanted to ask you, perhaps this will be the final question. I don't know if anyone else has anything, but how would you rank Fremont among Lincoln's other political generals, guys like Ben Butler and Dan Sickles and Carl Schurz, and the list goes on?
Yeah, none of them were very good. He was not, the problem is he had the most responsibility. Fremont stands out as a failure among the political generals because he was given the biggest job twice. Sure, the guys you mentioned were all, except for Butler, which was not quite the same, were given smaller commands. Butler was given command of New Orleans, but he didn't really have to fight a battle to do it. The Navy took care of it. Ironically, probably the most successful political general was Frank Blair, because he had jobs he could handle. I think you see much more success. Look at Chamberlain, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He had no military training. He was a professor, but he started out right as a colonel in command of a very small unit. And he was progressively promoted as he succeeded on the battlefield. But you could do that with a professor. Much more difficult to do that with a national hero. Been very difficult to give Fremont much less than he was given. But Longstreet wrote, after the war, Longstreet wrote one of those reminiscences about the war and just raked all of them. He did not differentiate between the guys you mentioned, Banks, Fremont, Schurz. None of them were very successful. They were in over their heads. And the ones that did have a degree of success, it was largely because they were in subordinate positions underneath competent commanders. And this is I think we have to hold Lincoln responsible for this. I talk about this some in the book. We can't just say, oh, those guys didn't know what they were doing. Well, who put them there? And we can't let Lincoln off the hook. He had reasons. Some of them were good reasons for appointing these people. But in the end, when they failed, it reflected badly on the man who appointed them.
Right. Anyone else have a question? If not, John, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation and great question and answer period.